morning, and thank you for joining Hudson Institute today for this discussion on the general election in Guatemala. My name is Dan Batlle, and I'm an adjunct fellow at Hudson Institute. The 2023 edition of the Latino Barometro survey ranks Guatemala as the country in the region with the lowest support for democracy. The decline in support for democracy over the last few years tracks the deterioration of democratic institutions in Guatemala and growing corruption and influence of organized crime. Going into the general elections, Guatemala seemed destined to continue this trend. In the first round of elections in June, many Guatemalans abstained from voting or cast blank votes. However, the second round became a referendum on the ruling establishment, and Guatemalans delivered a resounding victory for Bernardo Arévalo of the center-left Semilla party. Today, we have an outstanding group of panelists to help us make sense of this. Bernardo Rico is Program Director for the International Republican Institute for Guatemala and Honduras. In the past, he served as Deputy Assistant Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. He brings a long history with Guatemala, having served there in the Peace Corps and as head of the International Finance Corporation. We also have Marielos Chang, who is Professor of Political Science at one of Guatemalan's leading universities, Universidad del Valle. She's also co-founder of a civil society organization, Red Ciudadana. Edgar Ortiz is a professor and expert on Guatemalan constitutional law. He's a director of legal analysis at Guatemalan's leading free market think tank, Fundación Libertad y Desarrollo. And finally, we have Enrique Naveda, who is co-founder of a journalism platform, Plaza Pública, and he just returned to Guatemala from Stanford University, where he was a John S. Knight Fellow. I want to begin the discussion with Bernardo and ask you to put the elections in context for us. What was at stake in these elections?
So, no, thank you very much, Dan, and the Hudson Institute for having me. It's a big honor for me to be speaking with you virtually and among such distinguished panelists. I guess I would be remiss to also mention the fact that I've been married to a Guatemalan for 30 years, where we just celebrated our 30th anniversary the day after the elections here, and she helped me in actually observing the elections. So what was at stake? To give you some context, I'll steal a line from Ambassador Pop, who just left Guatemala, I believe, yesterday, and in my opinion, was probably one of the best U.S. ambassadors Guatemala's had in recent history. Ambassador Pop would always like to say that Guatemala is just only one border away from the U.S. So this pithy insight reveals both what I believe are risks and opportunities for both countries, or as Ambassador Pop would also like to say, what's good for Guatemala is also good for the U.S. So despite its own challenges, Guatemala has been one of our strongest allies in Latin America the last many decades, and has been a key partner in helping to stem irregular migration and drugs, namely cocaine, where the U.S. is still one of the world's largest consumer of that drug. The U.S. is also Guatemala's top trading partner, representing about 1/3 of its exports and imports. And despite the challenges that irregular migration represents to the U.S., remittances contribute to about 20% of Guatemala's GDP. So what Guatemala hasn't done well in the last several decades is bringing its political institutions into the 21st centuries. And I believe this, and as many, I think, probably on the panel, is really a job incumbent upon the Guatemalans themselves, and was very painfully evident during this last election process. I think what was at stake in this election process was democracy itself, and maybe even in question until the transition to the next president, to the president-elect Bernardo Arévalo on January 14th of next year. And as I and some of the other panelists will discuss, these elections demonstrated why Guatemalans have grown frustrated with the corruption they've suffered and their own belief in democracy. So a recent poll is a perfect example. When Guatemala signed its peace accords in 96, 50% of the population supported democracy. And about a year ago, only 37% did, with about 31% being indifferent to either a democratic or authoritarian form of government. However, I think that if all goes smoothly and then transition to the next president, and if Bernardo Arévalo governs closer to the center, I believe probably the next poll will reflect probably more support for democracy, but that's the verdict is still out on that. So to kind of try to understand why Guatemalans have been disheartened with democracy as the best form of government, I need to give you some context briefly and discuss two critical subsets for any thriving democracy. One is the election process itself, and the other being democratic governance, which is what we do mostly at IRI in our programming. These elections, I would say probably, and others, particularly, other panelists like Edgar will talk about, have been most distinct from other elections in recent times, going back probably to the military dictatorships that ended in the 80s, because all throughout this election process, which started in January of this year, the ruling government and allies really tried to attempt to frustrate the ability of the voters to decide who would be their next president and vice president. This included several tactics in trying to cancel certain candidates and their parties quite arbitrarily. Also at stake, and probably I would say most important, is the lifeblood of democracy, and a precondition for having free, fair elections is democratic governance. The electoral process and governance are kind of different concepts, yet they're interrelated. And in Guatemala, both have been on the decline in the last several decades, especially governance. So in this election year, the process itself really came close to being taken away from the Guatemalan people. And I actually still believe there are scenarios that actually may comprise the ultimate will of the people. That includes, for example, the cancellation of Semilla as a political party. So it's important to understand, just quickly, I'll try to do this, how this all happened. Over the last several decades, there's been a steady erosion of Guatemalan's political institutions, and kind of misunderstood by many outsiders, this really didn't happen overnight. This decline didn't even start under Jimmy Morales, because he didn't renew the UN's international community against impunity in Guatemala, known as CICIG. This is only partially the story. So during the mandate of CICIG from 2007 to 18, it had become a really powerful force in rooting out systemic graft and really trying to focus on holding public officials to account. CICIG's probably most successful case was the one where it uncovered a $1 billion customs bribery scheme in 2015 that ultimately resulted in the resignation and imprisonment of both Otto Perez Molina and his vice president, Roxana Batlle. It is worth noting that Otto Perez Molina, as of a few days ago, now has been released and under house arrest. Also worth noting is that under that case specifically, this had nothing to do with drug trafficking. And I think this is important to mention because there are a lot of people who believe, including Otto Perez Molina himself, who launched a debate that legalizing drugs would somehow remove the kind of corruption and crime that plagues Guatemala. What really affects Guatemala on a daily basis, which is, the lack of rule of law, are other crimes like extortion, which are the ones that are suffered by most Guatemalans. But, it's not just the people that I've mentioned, it's others at top levels of government, people within Otto Perez Molina administration, his ministers, many of whom are coming back, and even at the top levels of government, the mild-mannered former president Álvaro Colom was convicted in 2018 for a multi-million-dollar payment scheme. Colom recently passed away. His wife, just after his mandate, divorced him in order to circumvent a law preventing family members from running for presidency. And despite her attempts, Ms. Torres is now a third-time loser in Guatemala's elections. I still don't think she is going away completely, so this will be something to keep an eye on because she's still the leader of the party. But to kind of demonstrate even how far back or further back in recent times corruption goes, you have President Alfonso Portillo, who served from 2000 to 2004 and was extradited to the US for bribery and sentenced to 70 months in prison in 2014. He was released, I believe, less than 2 years later and returned to Guatemala and still remains popular among many Guatemalans. So the reality is that since the end of the military dictatorships in the mid-'80s and the signing of the peace accords to end its civil war in '96, democratic institutions have never fully taken root in Guatemala. There was a brief moment, I believe, during the '80s and '90s, but like other countries throughout Latin America and the world, it didn't last long. After the fall of the Soviet Union, democracy spread. And so in countries like Guatemala, they lived through a really big, strong decade of economic prosperity and democratic opening due to what I believe were major advancements in technology and free trade, including the passage of Central America's free trade agreement with the US, otherwise known as CAFTA. So this democratic capitalism propelled Guatemala's economic and democratization during this time. Unfortunately, it didn't last long, and there's some other countries in the region that suffered more. And I think many of us are aware of those countries, the worst being Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and now Honduras. So, two different very countries, but countries like Venezuela and Guatemala have been growing for quite some time, for decades in nominal economic terms, but its frail political institutions kind of persisted, which really made them vulnerable to state corruption or, corrupt actors. In various countries, it was really local maligned actors in the beginning, including social populists like Chavez in Venezuela, Correa in Ecuador, and later on Ortega in Nicaragua, that made the case to their electorate that the traditional political elites were not addressing the needs of the lower and middle classes, opening up the opportunity for populism and ultimately corruption. So it wasn't just local elites, right? Simultaneously, and I think many throughout the world and the West and even the United States took their eye off the ball and really saw gradually where Russia and China began looking for ways to make inroads into some of these countries, each with their own kleptocratic model. In Guatemala and in other Latin American countries, these populist propositions facilitated economic policies where the ends justified the means. This also happened, and it's important to note that it happened with the complicity of the private sector, and this was the case in Nicaragua. But whether it was a socialist regime or not, the kleptocracies and their actors began co-opting the state. And as long as, in particular, as the traditional private sector or those that in power decided or refrained from being involved in the political process directly, everything was fine. I think the worst case again is Nicaragua. In Guatemala, the modus operandi for a long time, and I think this dates back decades, has been for the private sector to really not get involved in politics and just staying in the background and financing candidates to support and protect their own interests. In my opinion, this has probably been one of Guatemala's biggest original sins. So a disinterest in politics really helped give rise to corrupt economic elites, often with ties to drug trafficking and other illicit businesses. So along with the proliferation of political parties in this last election, where you had 20 candidates, or 22 candidates, I believe, and rising discontent among the electorate with the status quo, this it kind of demonstrates or explains how Bernardo Arévalo, in my opinion, made it to the second round, because he was a relatively unknown candidate, but perhaps one of the most honest candidates and one with most integrity. It also explains why on the right, the conservative candidate Suri Rios performed so poorly, because the right, if there is one in ideological terms, in Guatemala, had its vote split among several candidates. But still, there's some room for hope. I think Guatemala stands out amongst its neighbors in Central America. It's different in the sense that it's a conservative country, both socially and economically. It's the region's largest economy. It's considered by the World Bank and others as an upper middle income country. And this is partially obviously explained by having the largest population of over 17 million people. Guatemala also, and this is often missed by those who really don't understand Guatemala, particularly its major population centers, benefits from a burgeoning middle class, which is very good. It also puts a strain on public resources for much needed improved infrastructure, public schools, healthcare, and definitely public security. So also in Guatemala's positive column are its robust economy, really, I think, supported by small and medium sized enterprises and a resilient formal private sector that's supported by mostly agro industry due to Guatemala's unique geographic position, steady rainfall in the rainy season, and during the dry season, a lot of sun, which makes for fertile valleys and plains that allows the country, compared to other countries in Central America, to grow a lot of commodities like sugar, coffee, bananas, palm oil, and others that actually generate a lot of foreign exchange. But much like Mexico and Colombia, Guatemala's rich farmland is also used to grow increasingly small amounts of opium poppy, and even more recently, cocoa, which is now being converted into cocoa paste before being exported and refined in Mexico by the cartels. So Guatemala's no longer just acting as a bridge for about 90% of the cocaine that arrives in the US from Colombia. It may be turned into a drug-producing country unless the state begins to recover vast stretches of ungoverned territory. But I do think it's a fallacy that Guatemala's decline began due to the increase in cocaine trafficking or drugs, although it's arguably gotten to a very bad point right now, both for Guatemala and Honduras. I think many Americans and even Latin Americans believe it is just Guatemala's and other countries like Mexico's unique geographic location that makes them vulnerable to the drug business. I think this only partially explains the problem. The real root cause, and I argue this as much as I possibly get the chance to, is the lack of a rule of law and just simply good governance. And the flip side of that is corruption. And in many countries, and I think actually Mexico is probably the worst in this, dates back over a century if you really study Mexico's history. So the weak rule of law that facilitated Guatemala to become a major transit country for cocaine, it goes back to the times of the 80s and the 90s when cocaine started to come through Guatemala quite a bit. But it also explains other factors like major out-migration to the US. Last year, Guatemala represented the second largest number of irregular migrants, about 222,000 that were apprehended at the US border. So with a population of 17 million, that shows you how relevant that is. Mexico was the first with 800,000 with a population of about 130 million people. And also to give you an idea how dangerous the migrants, it's not just the cocaine business, but it's the migrant smuggling business and how it's become. That business is now in the hands of the drug cartels like Sinaloa and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. These are the very same crime syndicates that bring into the United States fentanyl, heroin, meth, and cocaine. So just quickly wrapping it up, and before I turn it over to Edgar, who knows a lot about Guatemala's constitutional political law and history, I just like to put the factor or the issue of rule of law or the lack thereof within kind of as much as possible scientific terms with some data provided by the World Justice Project. So in 2022, Guatemala placed 110 out of 140 countries. It's also worth noting that Mexico was worse than Guatemala in this instance. And I actually believe that as our largest trading partner and producer and exporter of drugs in our hemisphere, we need to worry about Mexico also because our relations with that country have been declining. And I think to really kind of sum it up and really understand why the declining rule of law influenced this election, you can look at another submeasure that the World Justice Project provides, and that's on civil justice. So this is pretty surprising. So Guatemala here placed 135 out of 140 countries. So only, you know, 5 other countries, including Afghanistan, were worst. And according to the World Justice Project, civil justice gauges whether ordinary people can resolve their grievances peacefully and effectively through the civil justice system, and whether the systems are accessible and affordable. And I think perhaps most relevant, that they are free of discrimination, corruption, and improper influence by public officials. And just one last point that I believe makes Guatemala's model of corruption unique, and this is something that is often misunderstood compared to, for example, what's going on in Honduras under the Xiomara Castro regime, which really is kind of a reflection of her husband who's running the show behind the scenes, or in El Salvador with Bukele, and obviously other countries like Nicaragua. Here, it's not necessarily the government, you know, one that's in power that is kind of responsible for the corruption, and the one that kind of compromises its political institutions and preventing political institutions from taking root. The corruption that happens in Guatemala is comprised of a vast and complex network of corrupt politicians, some emerging private sector actors who have made their riches off the backs of Guatemalan taxpayers in recent years, and of course, those who are involved in narco trafficking. So that's kind of probably a long answer to your first question, but I'll leave it at that for the moment, Dan.
Thank you for that excellent introduction. Edgar, I want to go to you. You've written about the judicialization of Guatemalan politics. It has a long history, but can you explain a little bit that history and how the role of the courts changed a little bit in this last election?
Thanks, Dan. Well, it's a complicated issue, and maybe I would like to say a few things before explaining the judicialization in the current electoral process. And it is that in Guatemala, we have a system of, we have a constitutional court, specialized body that is in charge of constitutional matters, as opposed to the US, in which you have a Supreme Court that has play the same role. And this constitutional court was designed as we know it in the 1985 Constitution. And at some point it was designed, it was think of as a veto actor, right? And it has the possibility to rule the laws of Congress unconstitutional, but it also has the capacity to invalidate any act of government that violates the Constitution. But we have to bear in mind that the standards to file an amparo, extraordinary protection action, I don't know how to translate exactly amparo into English because it's a peculiar constitutional procedure. But the thing is, the standard to file an amparo is very low, and almost anyone can file an amparo. That is true from the constitutional text, but it's even more true since 2009 by jurisprudence. The court has established that in order to protect constitutional rights, any citizen can file an amparo to request constitutional court's protection. And historically speaking, to me, 1993 marks a very important moment for the Constitutional Court. In that year, President Serrano Elias tried to, and it failed. He tried to dissolve Congress and to dissolve the Supreme Court and to perform a self-coup d'etat like Fujimori did in Peru, and he failed. And the thing is, in that moment, the Constitutional Court issued a ruling ex officio, which is weird for a court to do. They never can issue a ruling ex officio. And the military, the army, they say, okay, let's abide by the Constitutional Court ruling. And to me, that symbolically marked a moment in which the army gave this invisible power to the Constitutional Court to decide, political matters. And over the years, the Constitutional Court's conformation, which is very political, these judges are appointed by the executive branch, Congress, Supreme Court of Justice, the public university for historical reasons, and the Bar Association of Lawyers. The processes to design the judges are not technical or based on merit, are purely political. So the court tends to be highly politicized. But by informal rules in the past, most of the judges used to be, used to behave in ways that they have self-constraint. They try not to bother the international community. They abide by democratic principles. And during the period from 2009 to 2019, the court mostly played a sort of enlightenment role, right? Most of the political crises that reached the Constitutional Court were resolved in ways that were intended to protect democratic principles. For example, in 2009, there was a very dirty process to select judges of the Supreme Court of Justice, and the Constitutional Court intervened, granting an amparo injunction to a private citizen, requesting Congress to abide by merits and transparency principles in order to select the judges of the Supreme Court. In 2010, it invalidated the designation of an attorney general based on accusations of corruption. They did the same in 2019. In fact, we don't have yet a new Supreme Court of Justice based on a Constitutional Court ruling. But what happened in 2021, the powerful political actors, they learned that if they wanted to control the whole system, they needed to control the Constitutional Court. So they appointed judges that were loyal to their interest. And there's a second factor we have to bear in mind. In Guatemala, we don't have presidential re-election by constitutional design. And we have a highly fragmented Congress. So if we want to understand Guatemalan politics, we have to understand that the president is mostly, is powerful in terms of the budget he manages, and he's powerful in terms of, the tools, the legal tools he has to govern. But since 2004, no president has a majority in Congress. So Guatemala right now has a ruling coalition of around 10 or 12 political parties. And this ruling coalition share a common interest to destroy the fight against corruption that Bernardo clearly explained before. And in order to do so, they took control of the Attorney General's office, the Constitutional Court, and any other branch that you can imagine that is in charge of, any other instance of checks and balance. And in this year, in January, when the election began, they had this plan in mind. They say, okay, we don't have a single presidential candidate from the coalition, so we are going to compete to each other for the presidency. So you could see 23 candidates running for office, and the ruling coalition, almost any of these parties had their own presidential candidate. But they say also, we are going to disqualify any candidate from the opposition using legal tools. And in their mind, that was a good plan to prevent the opposition from winning. And so they use the tools they have. So the tools they have is, since we have this powerful constitutional court that was using these tools in the past to support fight of corruption, to prevent bad guys from taking office in the Attorney General's office or in the Supreme Court, they use the same tools, but now to disqualify their opponents. And it was very easy to do, because in 2019, for example, given these open tools open to any citizen, the Constitutional Court disqualified 4 presidential candidates, including Movimiento Semillas presidential candidate, which was Telma Aldana, the former Attorney General. And but the difference from 2019 to 2023 is that in the last elections, most of the objections to presidential candidates came from different, political or individual citizens. The case of Telma Aldana was clearly something that came from the ruling coalition, we may call it. But you had the case of Edwin Escobar, a former mayor of a city close to Guatemala City, that was disqualified by, I don't know, for any other political rival. In 2023, the difference is that you had this ruling coalition targeting opponents, clearly targeting opponents. And they disqualify first Telma Cabrera from the far left, but also Roberto Arzu from the right. Why? Because they thought they had, a reasonable chance of winning. And in May, they were surprised. The plan was going wrong because this guy, Carlos Pineda, populist, appeared in the polls in the first place. The registration period was closed. Usually they use the registration of candidates as an excuse to object the rivals, the opponent's registration process. And in May, the process was closed, was already closed, and they invented this thesis that given that in the past, in the last party's assembly, the party of Carlos Pineda, there were some irregularities. They invented that was enough to declare anything from November of 2022 null. They annul the party's proclamation of candidates. They nullified the Carlos Pineda registration as presidential candidate 1 month before the election. And luckily for Bernardo Arévalo, now the president elected, he didn't, he didn't figure in the polls as a serious candidate, a serious contender. So they never touched him before the election. But the thing is, it is interesting to observe how the ruling coalition used the tools that were designed to protect individual rights. They used those tools to attack their opponents via amparo, which is a constitutional proceeding designed to protect individual rights citizens, and they also used this jurisprudence that was brought in 2015 when the Constitutional Court, with good intentions, ruled that anyone can challenge or can object the registration of any candidate. And that opened the door for the ruling coalition to start this process of what I call, legal bullying. They started bullying all their opponents legally. And since they have, of course, control of the Constitutional Court, that was easy for them to do. And if we go to congressional level, they disqualify also members from the opposition. I mean, Aldo Davila, a congressman from a leftist party, was disqualified just because they didn't like him. I mean, it was very easy to do. And so to me, it's interesting to observe how Guatemala has this particularity, in which the Constitutional Court has historically played a big role in political crisis. And it's very interesting to see how this political fragmentation gives the court a more important role, since you cannot reach agreement in the political arena. The political elites use the Constitutional Court as a weapon to attack opponents, and they use Constitutional Court as a weapon to invalidate legislation they don't like. For example, how did political elites recover control from the Supreme Court, which is another court, as I explained? The Supreme Court is important because most criminal cases reach the Constitutional Court, and since we have the cases that the former United Nations Commission Against Corruption left, you have these cases ongoing, and you need to, recover your freedom if you are a corrupt politician accused of of crimes, they recover the control of the Supreme Court also by a ruling of the Constitutional Court. They issue a unconstitutional action against the judicial career law, and the Constitutional Court decided that the Constitutional Court justices have control over lower judges, for example. So it is not only about disqualifying rivals in presidential elections. It's about controlling the system through the Constitutional Court, which is, as I contend, a very Guatemalan aspect.
Thank you, Edgar. I want to change gears a little bit and go to Marielos. We saw a real shift in the level of participation and enthusiasm between the first round and the second round. Can you talk a little bit about just the mobilization that took place in that period and what its significance was for the election?
Yes, so thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for letting me be here. I want to start by answering your question by saying that in many ways, these elections were historic. Firstly, because as Bernardo explained, because of the survival of democracy was at stake. And I don't know, somehow we end up choosing the option that is going to buy us 4 more years in democracy if nothing happens between here and January. And secondly, because we witnessed the impressive amount of young citizens that volunteered to be Movimiento Semillas inspectors at the voting centers. And I want to focus on this, so let me explain this a little bit more. Besides the citizens who are part of the Juntas Receptoras de Votos, who are the citizens that handle you the ballot and then count the ballot out loud, political parties usually have representatives at the tables that we call them fiscales de mesa, verifying that the votes are being tabulated and then being correctly noted into the official records. So usually the party representatives that I'm going to call fiscales from now on get paid or benefit in other ways by each of the political parties. But during the first round, Movimiento Semilla had at the voting center less than 20% of fiscales needed to cover the entire country. However, for the second round, they had 80% of coverage. So Semilla fiscales at the end of the second round accounted for only 10% less than the ones that Partido UNE had. So they were able to have almost the same amount of fiscales that UNE party had. Nonetheless, the most impressive fact about this was that the citizens represented the Movimiento Semilla were unpaid volunteers and mostly young people. They didn't receive any payment or special benefits. They brought their food themselves, or they were fed by other concerned citizens who organized for such purpose. So how do we explain what motivated thousands of young people to voluntarily sign up to be monitors for the voting centers? In simple words, after the surprising results of June 25th, where Movimiento Semilla defeated everyone except Sandra Torres, the legal, or should I say illegal, attacks from the Ministerio Público started. So this was seen by many citizens as a complete violation of their right to vote and their right to choose. And as I pointed out in the article published by America's Quarterly, this angry many people. So they, the citizens, and especially the younger citizens, became active voices against such illegal maneuvers. And when Movimiento Semilla asked for volunteers, these young concerned citizens offered them themselves without hesitation. So these attacks against Movimiento Semilla by the public ministry end up reinforcing the powerful idea that these elections were not normal and that defending the results was crucial for Guatemalans. It was imperative to fight for the future of democracy and the upholding of the results at the polls. So this participation was decisive because it helped to neutralize the actions that Partido UNE had planned beforehand. For example, to challenge the results at the polling stations in mass. And I want to share a little story about this. I heard from many people who were fiscales for the Movimiento Semilla party that they were trying, or they were actually convincing the fiscales from the Partido UNE to act fair and square during the counting of the votes. And I think that kind of helped. Other ways the concerned citizens mobilized was through social media. After June 25th, many content creators fought via TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram the attempts to undermine the confidence in the elections. So this helped to neutralize the false narratives that the losing parties were trying to impose in the public opinion about a possible fraud. And finally, and I think this is the most interesting thing about what happened in Sunday's election, was the victory celebration. Precisely because this process felt more like a struggle between the system and the citizens, so celebrating the results felt like celebrating a huge victory for the country. So that is why the vast majority of the flags waved at the Plaza Obelisco and Plaza Central. And let me explain this. Like, Plaza Obelisco is the place that you go to celebrate a victory from the team soccer, or you go on the Independence Day to light up the torch. And because we have this tradition on Independence Day, you need to light up your torch and then start running the whole city. But Plaza Obelisco is a place that you go to celebrate a national victory. And that's how it felt on Sunday night, because we saw a lot of national flags. The Guatemalan flag was everywhere and not much the flag of Movimiento Semilla. So in conclusion, I would say that the mobilization of citizens was not in the way that we didn't have more participation than in the first round. We have 45 participation from people who went and vote. That is normal, only 3% more than the last election. But the mobilization was explained, as explained it before, in the way that they actually participate in the electoral process, in the way they actually celebrated the winning victory of Semilla.
Thank you. Enrique, the press in Guatemala has been under attack in recent years. Can you talk about the role of the press in this election, and just a little bit about the role of media in supporting democracy in Guatemala?
Hi, Dan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Let me start by saying, or by mentioning, Fundación Libertad y Desarrollo last survey, I think, or the one before the last one. There's a slide that mentions how Guatemalan get information, where they get it from, what sources of information they use, and they've used during the last elections. And almost 50% of them get their information, their political information, from television. Also, 50% of them, almost 50% of them, get their information from social media. And then there's a group of sources that are quite minimal, like radio with 12%, personal conversation 6%, print press 6%, and news websites 4%. So that gives you a sense of what the system is like, the information system is like. Then the media system is mainly privately owned. It is very deconcentrated, very decentralized, but not very pluralist in terms of ideology. You could easily show or argue how most of the media are on the conservative, or at least on the right-leaning side of the political spectrum. Many radios and TV stations partly depend on the state for revenue through advertising contracts, but they also depend on the state for their very profitable frequency leases, which need to be renewed after a period of time, every now and then. What the government expects from those radio and TV stations in return is political allegiance and propaganda most of the time, but particularly in critical moments. In critical moments, most of these media are hardly independent from the ruling coalition that Edgar mentioned, and it becomes quite evident. Critical moments are not only elections. To give you a sense, we've lived the last 5 to 8 years under the feeling of a deep political crisis. And so those media have behaved accordingly. In addition to that, the biggest media, the biggest ones, owned by the Mexican mogul Ángel González, who always favors leading pro-establishment candidates, were undergoing legal prosecutions due to charges of illegal financiation to the political parties. And the same goes for some other smaller outlets like Canal Antigua or República GT, whose owners are either fugitive or have been legally accused of corruption and trying to rig past elections. On the other hand, you may find an array of independent outlets, both traditional and non-traditional, ranging from daily to investigative to and explanatory journalism, and also commentary. Those outlets and journalists that rank among the smaller sources of electoral information for Guatemalans, say radio, print media, and websites, but are very influential in the public conversation in social media, have been experiencing a growing harassment in the last 6, 7 to 8 years. Not only conducted by bot farms on social media that we think belong to the political and judiciary elite, but also by corporate power and some far-right civil society organizations linked to the former military accused of human rights violations during the Civil War. Reporters Without Borders said in their last report that freedom of the press is guaranteed by the Constitution in Guatemala, but this right is constantly violated by government officials and politicians. Journalists and media, and I'm quoting, journalists and media outlets who investigate or criticize corruption and human rights violations face harassment campaigns and criminal prosecutions. Guatemala's position in this ranking, in Reporters Without Borders ranking, has plummeted in the last decade. And in the last year alone, it has gone from position 124 to position 127. Many journalists nowadays have had to flee the country during the last years, and some of them, like Juan Luis Font or Michel Mendoza, have been permanently on exile for the last couple of years or so. But also journalists, very, very well-known and well-known journalists like José Rubén Zamora, who was the founder of a leading investigative newspaper, El Periódico, has been in prison for the last year, and they're absolutely fake charges. Also, Carlos Choc, community journalist, has been facing legal prosecution, prosecution and persecution, and a lot of harassment from mining companies. He lives in the countryside. And also the CFO of El Periódico has been accused of money laundering, etc. So the moment for us, the moment for journalists is quite critical, but there is still a big amount of very small news outlets that are fighting for democracy, that have been have kept doing investigative journalism, particularly about corruption in government, and have been keeping an eye on the elections, so that everything, like civil society, so that everything came out the way it did, which is not perfect. I think we all agree that it was a fraudulent elections from the beginning, with the disqualification of candidates, unlawful disqualification of candidates, but at least the election day came out well.
Thank you. Bernardo, coming back to you, you spoke about the quality of democratic governance. In just a few minutes, can you describe the main governance challenges that Arévalo faces, and where where Guatemalan democracy needs to be strengthened?
Yeah, so I think that for many people, there's a huge opportunity, right? There's a lot of hope that's being felt in Guatemala based on the election of Arévalo, primarily because of his campaign platform and his authenticity in wanting to fight corruption. So there are many people, just as the other panelists just explained, who are more than willing to kind of ensure that even in the worst case scenario, that Arévalo may not even be able to take power on January 14th. That's still a distinct possibility as the and I think Edgar can explain this better, you know, after October 31st, the kind of immunity from a political candidate standpoint goes away, so he can and his party can be continue to be prosecuted from the penal instance, which has been, you know, attempted in the past throughout the elections, but had no validity because he was a political candidate. But after October 31st, that process may continue. So it really depends upon, to the degree to which I think, you know, some of the malign actors, you know, I hate to say this, but, you know, including people who support the current president behind them, you know, the people that I mentioned, you know, the kind of different people that I mentioned, private sector actors, you know, people who have gotten new riches, and even, you know, and this is somewhat sensitive, but I would say even retired military officials who are all more than willing to kind of like support or, you know, prevent Arévalo from taking power. There's a more likely scenario that I think one of the panelists might have mentioned. I think I said it first as well, that Arévalo's party stands a great chance of being canceled based on these irregularities that have been asserted against how Semilla came about, you know, how many the signatures that were gotten, certain individuals who have passed away since the formation of the party. So this would make Arévalo a president and his vice president coming into power without a party. So he would be an independent president. And also his deputies in Congress would be independent and prevented from taking any leadership positions in the various committees. So that only makes more difficult. So even if that doesn't happen, Arévalo has, I believe, only 23 deputies, 160 within Congress. So, you know, building coalitions already is going to be difficult with the opposition in order to pass laws. But if he doesn't have a political party, I'm not quite sure how this plays out in terms of kind of a constitution of alliances, right? It'll be interesting to see what happens with parties like UNE, Vamos, Valor, Cabal, and what they decide to do in terms of, you know, deciding whether or not to work with Semilla on certain legislation or not. But I think probably the most important thing, and, you know, that's very important from kind of the procedural standpoint. And, you know, so if his party isn't canceled, at least there's a chance to get some stuff done, right? And I can get to that in a second. But I think most importantly, and if, you know, to the degree possible, recovering the judicial system is of primary importance. And this starts with the overdue election of justices in the Supreme Constitutional Courts. And, you know, to help deliver on his campaign promise of fighting corruption, where there are a lot of expectations for him to do so, I think one of Arévalo's challenges, but, you know, he can actually remedy this, is by putting in high quality ministers and vice ministers in place and holding them to the highest standards possible. I think that will help him a lot. And I think it's going to be necessary for Arévalo to build a coalition beyond just, you know, his traditional base, maybe. And, you know, maybe he doesn't really have his traditional base because he was, you know, really brought into office because people were fed up with the status quo and wanted change and corruption to be addressed. But I do think to a certain degree, there's a base there. He's going to have to kind of go beyond that base and work with the private sector, who's already demonstrated willingness and openness to work with Arévalo. So I think there's reason for optimism. I think there's obviously a strong role for the U.S. To play, and I've said this many times. I think, you know, putting individuals on certain, you know, corrupt actors or, you know, criminals on lists may help in investigations and kind of bring the investigations to fruition and allow them to be prosecuted. But then you just look at the end result, at least under previous administrations, what happens to many individuals is they end up fleeing the country. Maybe that won't be the case under Arévalo's administration, but that's something that I think needs to be reconsidered, perhaps, to what extent the U.S. use those lists, because sometimes, honestly, they seem like veiled threats. Sometimes they're overused, and, you know, often they're individuals are placed on those lists years after the fact, so it kind of looks a little bit strange. And I think that the U.S. would have more credibility in promoting the rule of law, more strongly if they use those lists more judiciously, because they're often, they're politicized, as I think I've said, by many on the right. And this last kind of stick option is something that I talk about. It's sensitive, of course, but maybe called the nuclear option. But if it's done properly, it has a lot of impact. So I believe the USG in the last 3 years extradited 150 individuals to the U.S. with the cooperation of the Guatemalan government. So we have to give them kudos for that. I do think finding higher level officials that have nexuses, and that's the only way that you can actually extradite someone, nexuses with either drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, and arms trafficking. I think that would send a right message. But we can't just use a stick. I mean, that there has to be more than that. And I think you have to look too at, I think Guatemalans, and they're going to look to Arévalo and, others, but Guatemalans are going to look to like what happens to officials who have faced local justice, who have been later released. And there are a whole series of names recently, including, as I mentioned, former President Otto Pérez Molina, who will now be under house arrest. And you have even individuals who have been extradited to the United States, including Manuel Valdizón, who was, as I think many people believe, the front man that helped cancel Carlos Pineda's party. These people are extradited to the U.S., serve some jail time, and then are released and come back to Guatemala to reinsert themselves into politics. I think Dr. Arévalo and his cabinet should try to seek help from the U.S., working with the State Department, USAID, and INL to strengthen its democratic institutions. I mean, this is a long-term process that I think many of us understand that's going to take decades. And I think there's an opportunity to, restart that process now. But I do think that, it's also that help or assistance from the U.S. is going to require the help of the DOJ and DA to actually, use that kind of stronger option, as I mentioned. And this is also something, lastly, I'll kind of try to wrap this up. I think this is a little bit, there's some division amongst Guatemalans and even people, international community and U.S. government on this. I think in fighting corruption, I think that Dr. Arévalo should be really careful and avoid resurrecting any type of body that looks or smells like decisive. And I also think he's got to be very careful of bringing back in a formal capacity, working capacity, any of the former prosecutors or judges that are living in exile in the United States that were in charge of, they were very involved in prosecuting very big cases, because that will only go to polarize Guatemala more, particularly those on the right, and this whole narrative of the U.S., the infringement on Guatemala's sovereignty, and it would just really kind of jeopardize any potential consensus building, excuse me, and the reestablishment of trust, which is probably one of the most needed elements in rebuilding Guatemalan society today. And lastly, I think beyond the democratic governance work and some of those sticks, I think on the carrot side, I think the U.S. really needs to rethink, not just in Guatemala, but all throughout Latin America. I mean, we're certainly not going to compete against the likes of the PRC and their model of investment in Latin America and other developing regions like Africa. But I do think if Guatemala is truly going to be an ally to the United States, a small country where the U.S. can make a significant difference, the U.S. could provide better economic incentives in supporting not just the building of democratic institutions, but through major economic investment. And having worked in government too, there's a limited time for Bernardo Arévalo to govern, and there's a limited time for anyone to govern anywhere. But just announcing, potential investment and having it not being followed through is really not going to help. I mean, and this is, I think, was the case in Honduras, where Honduras was expecting, maybe more investment in the country, and Xiomara Castro really didn't see, the proof in the pudding, and probably would have done it anyway, but quickly turned to China by flipping from Taiwan to China. So the U.S., to the degree possible, with U.S. companies, could bring in more investment, bringing in the Development Finance Corporation. And having worked in banking myself years ago too, the DFC's predecessor, OPIC, used to leverage U.S. banks quite a bit from New York to actually help on that investment. So I think if the U.S. were more strategic in doing so and providing that investment, I think that would go a long way to building kind of the relationship between Guatemala and the U.S. and kind of really showing the Guatemalans that the U.S. is serious about helping them. Because, I think I just mentioned it, but otherwise, we're not going to be, the U.S. Is not going to be any match for the PRC, Honduras being the most recent example where they flipped. And I was kind of surprised, not just, I think U.S. government was necessarily surprised because Xiomara Castro made that promise throughout her campaign, but I was quite surprised talking to individuals within the private sector in Honduras, how quickly they kind of turned and said, well, hey, if China can bring in serious investment in infrastructure, then we're all ears. So I think that recent example in Honduras should be concerning to the U.S. And I guess I'll just end it by here, because it's not something that's gonna happen, but it is a distinct possibility that Guatemala may at some point decide to change and open relationships with the People's Republic of China. And unfortunately, they'll play a negative, outsized negative role in the country. And it's something, just lastly, it's something difficult to, for the U.S., I think, as the U.S. government tries to roll out its counter-China strategy. At IRI, we actually have something where we work to actually help do that. But you have to look at examples like, I remember when I was working here with the IFC of the World Bank, Costa Rica was one of the, I think the first Central American country to flip in 2007. But Costa Rica's democratic governance is quite different than that of Honduras or even Guatemala. So I think that right mix of kind of incentives and kind of sticks, I guess, is probably the only word I can think of right now, is necessary. But I think the U.S. really needs to show that it's committed to helping rebuild democracy in Guatemala, and I think they're going to find an open and willing partner in Bernardo Arévalo. So
Thanks, Bernardo. I want to give others a chance to respond, because you've touched on several topics that I know there are a range of views on. So I just want to open up the floor briefly to others to respond on, first, on the matter of corruption and mechanisms such as CICIG. I also want to open the floor to the U.S. Role in Guatemala, and also more lastly regarding China and Guatemala's relationship with China. So, I welcome any of you to comment on those.
Well, I think that regarding the role of the U.S., I think Bernardo Arévalo is in a difficult position. To me, his government is like a transition, a government in a transition. If you think about it, in 1986, when we transitioned to democracy, the first two governments or three administrations had to govern in this context of transition. You had the military as a powerful actor, which which was there and held a lot of power and influence. To me, this time, what we have in Guatemala is a new government, which is there by accident almost, and because of the, absolutely absurd plans of the ruling coalition. That was what enabled Bernardo to win. In other contexts, if they didn't disqualify the rivals, I'm pretty sure Arévalo wouldn't be the president right now. And he will find these old forces holding a lot of power. I'm speaking of political elites that made their fortune by corruption, but also organized crime, because organized crime is also a big player among the Guatemalan, political chess. So he needs to be wise enough to understand that if he's too radical, or if he intends to change things so quickly, he will find a lot of resistance among these powerful players. So that is a big thing. So what can the U.S. do for us? I mean, if what is good for the U.S. is good for Guatemala, and it goes both ways. And I think to support the building capabilities, the consensus among the U.S. political establishment is that if you want to reduce migration and if you want to preserve regional hemispheric security, you need to have reliable partners. And we need to rebuild the police forces. That was a big, we made big advances during the last 15 years, but those advancements were reversed by Jimmy Morales' administration from 2018 onwards. So that's a good aspect. Justice system. We need to rebuild our entire justice system. I don't know how much consensus will the future government have in order to rebuild the justice system, or build the justice system, maybe because it was never built. But those aspects are key. And so I think that support is important, and also to fight the narco traffic. We can do it alone. We need your support from the U.S. government. And regarding China, I think Bernardo Arévalo will be a reliable partner for the U.S. He won't change the previous policies. We are clearly with Taiwan. That's not going to change with Bernardo Arévalo. I mean, to me, the big risk for the U.S. in terms of Chinese influence in Guatemala, it comes from the ruling coalition, because at some point, the ruling coalition is showing how far they are willing to go. I mean, right now they are trying to prevent the elected Congress persons from Semilla to take in office. They just send a request to the congressional board to say, hey, the party is suspended by the Attorney General's office by this spurious prosecution. So to me, the ruling coalition is so predatory, and they are willing to overthrow democracy. And, the U.S. cannot allow that to happen. And the Chinese, they don't mind. They don't mind if you destroy democracy. Look at Nicaragua. So to me, the big risk for the U.S. in terms of Chinese influence is if the ruling coalition can prevail and prevent Bernardo Arévalo and Semilla to reform and to govern, they may go to China's arms immediately, because China will not ask questions regarding democracy, human rights, or rule of law. And so I think we have a big opportunity now, but a lot of challenges.
Enrique, I want to give you a chance to respond on any of those topics.
I'm missing one actor here, which is the private sector, the traditional private sector. And I would like to start by saying that I regard the traditional private sector, the organized private sector in Guatemala, part of this ruling elite, this ruling coalition that we've been talking about, and that in Guatemala we call the pact of the corrupt. And I would like to remind you of a book, Why Nations Fail, where the authors mention that there can be extractive or inclusive institutions. Extractive institutions are those that the authors deem we have in Guatemala, both on the political side and the economic side, meaning that economic actors, private sector in Guatemala is extractive. And that is why they happen to be in coalition with this pack of the corrupt. Did they play a different role in these elections? I think they did play a slightly different role during the electoral process, probably owing to the fact that some of the most prominent traditional business people in the country were accused of illegal financiation some 5 or 6 years ago. So they weren't as evident when trying to influence the elections as they were before. Their role has been a little less visible, a little less prominent. But also I think that their power has waned a lot in the last decades. But particularly, it has diminished during the last administration, Yamatei's administration, not because of the rise of other private sector competitors, but because of Yamatei's efficient power grab. He's been the most efficient ruler in Guatemala in the last 30 years in grabbing power. I believe that even though many of the traditional elite actors felt comfortable with belonging to the ruling coalition, rather than leaders, they have been followers. They benefited from it, but from a position of subordination, which is not their traditional position. A decade and a half ago, Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the Inter-American Development Bank published a report called the Politics of Public Policy, where they deemed the Guatemalan private sector as the most influential corporate elite in Latin America, where corporate elites are quite powerful, even though by that time they had already been losing ground for decades. And their clash with emergent business people and politicians was already evident. It was evident until 2016, I would argue, when they were accused of illegal financiation to parties, and they were prosecuted. That prosecution, adding to the prosecution against politicians, judges, justices, mayors, and other business people, gathered all of them around the same goal, which was banning CICIG from Guatemala, which was recovering impunity. So that coalition was created there, and it's the coalition and the moment that explains everything that is happening right now. So I believe that the role of some of the most reactionary leaders of the private sector during these elections has been suffocating internal dissent, because not every business person in the country thinks like them or is corrupt or anything, but they've been suffocating dissent, and we wrote a book about that. We published a book about that. Also silently supporting the ruling coalition that is called, as I said, the part of the corrupt, and fostering and financing legal prosecution against rivals. But as we've already said, they have failed greatly. And Arévalo's and Semilla victory seems to have put them in a very difficult position. And one could expect, and I think there are already clues that it is happening, that they need to bestow more of a leading role to their more centrist and reformist members and ostracize the more extremist views. I think that's happening already.
We're running out of time, but I want to give Marielos a chance to respond. Or if you, I wanted to also get your view on what the lessons are of this election for other movements in other countries. But feel free to respond and then respond to the question.
Yeah, I would like to add some comments regarding the fight against corruption that Arévalo is gonna face in the next couple of years. I know that Bernardo and Edgar and Enrique already said some things, but I wanna add some things as well. The first one is that in order to achieve the necessary consensus, they need to achieve a necessary consensus and alliances in order to have certain degree of governance. And we already noticed that the private sector is calling for a pact of governments as well. So let's hope that that actually works. But we know that if the public ministry or Ministerio Público Consuelo is still in the public ministry, that will be really difficult. And after accomplishing that, the next, by no means is a small feat, will be deciding which road to take in order to tackle corruption. So one way will be to fight corruption with criminal cases and apprehending the people responsible for committing such crimes. However, as Enrique already mentioned, the recent experience derived from this decisive debacle, we know that this could, and we will probably incite a violent response from the dominant coalition, and it could result in a severe ungovernability. And also, this doesn't necessarily solve the problem of corruption. We already know that because of what happened with CICIG in Guatemala. And the other way, or the other path, will be to accomplish some reforms that included the justice sector reforms that already Edgar mentioned, and that can help limit the political influence that congressmen have over the courts today and vice versa. So this path could lay the foundation for modernizing and transforming the current obsolete system, but this proves to be the most difficult path for at least two reasons. First, because in order to pass all these reforms, you need to have a majority in Congress, and Movimiento Semilla doesn't have that. You only have 23 votes, and at least you need to have 80 or 81, and if you need to do it quickly, you need 80 and 105 votes in Congress, and they don't have that right now. And the other thing is that reforms, like the results for the reforms, it takes time to see the results. And probably Semilla will not see the fruits or the results of these reforms if he managed to do so. And the successor will be able to grab that results if he managed to do so. So Bernardo faces a daunting scenario. However, unlike his predecessors, Bernardo Arévalo's political career has shown that he may be very capable to reconcile opposition agents and advance confronted agendas. So at the end, I would say that it will be up to him to combine high-impact criminal prosecutions for corruption to calm the citizen demand, and also negotiate reforms with Congress to change the system. That's regarding the challenge he will face in terms of fighting corruption. And regarding the lessons, I would like to mention some of the ideas that the PH candidate Manuel Melendez Sanchez already mentions on Twitter, and add some of my own. He says that what happened with Semilla was almost by accident. I think everybody here agrees with that. Nobody saw that the possibility that Bernardo was able to win the presidency. And I want to add that we, the analysts, and I add myself in that list, play our part by ruling out any chances that Movimiento Semilla had in the elections. And that kind of helped, I would say, because he never was saw as a challenge or as a menace to the coalition, the politic dominant coalition. So he was able to compete. And we already know what happened with the other adversaries that were trying to proclaim the same themselves as opposition stance. So that would be one thing. But the other thing is that Movimiento Semilla did his homework. During the 3 years that they were in Congress, they managed to show themselves as an opposition that pointed out the corruption and injustice committed by Alejandro Yamatei. So they didn't have the power nor the votes in Congress to stop the nation's general's budget to be approved, or to other authoritarian laws to be approved. But they did have the attention of the public on social media, and that helped. That helped because during the last year, social media, and especially TikTok, became one of the most important sources of information at national level. This reduced the power traditional outlets and the mainstream media had, like Enrique already mentioned, and gave the opportunity to Semilla to reach successfully to every corner of the country without the needing of the blessing of the angel of democracy. That's how we call Angel Gonzalez, who is the owner of the national channel. So that was one thing. And the other thing is that they also form local organizations and prepare the basis. And to this, I must add that they never stop believing, and they successfully convey such a powerful emotion through their speeches, through their videos, and through their messages. So in conclusion, I would say, and the greatest lesson is that in hybrid democracies, such as the one we have in Guatemala, you must bet on the long game. Always, at some point, non-democratic regimes will make mistakes, and only then you will have to take the chance. You will have the chance to take advantage of this situation. So in many ways, or in some ways, it goes like this famous Afghan proverb, like they have the watches, but we have the time. But for Guatemala, it will be like they have everything to win, but we have the boats.
Thanks, Marielos. This has been an important and fascinating conversation. I want to thank each of you for joining us today and for your insights. Clearly, the situation in Guatemala is one that bears watching. To our audience, thank you for joining us today.